Hi, good evening and welcome to this CPD webinar. My name is Andrew and I will be facilitating tonight's webinar, and I'll very shortly be handing you over to the fabulous Dr. Karen, talking all things concussion. So great to have you. Thursday the 6th of July 2023, 8 p.m. And let's have a look in the chat to see what's going on in the chat. We are still filling the room up yet, which is good. So let me share my screen and we will get this presentation underway. Here we are. Don't look at my mucky desktop. I knew you were looking and you were peeping at it. So the new UK Concussion Guidelines in Grassroots Sports. I'm quite looking forward to tonight's webinar. I've got my little notepad and pen ready for some of my little magic golden nuggets of learning, and I hope you too do. So for those who are new to webinars, we can't see or hear you. So we would like you to interact in the chat for us. So please do pop in the chat, tell us where you're dialing in from tonight, tell us what you do for a living, because that's always very useful to us. And I'm just going to try and get my chat window up now, because I like to have a little look see who's on. So we've got Pam, Madeira, evening, Robert from a soggy west of Ireland. We've got Paul, Sally, who's a basics doctor from Morrisshire. I'm guessing that is Scotland. I honestly should have tried better at college. I sat at the back of the geography class and just was more interested in biology, which is why I do what I do, I guess. Anyway, there we are. So please do pop into the chat. So I often say, if you're sat there in your dressing gown or you've just got out of the shower and we can't see you, we can't hear you, well, I'm glad to tell you, we've actually just bought some CPD dressing gowns and we are about genuinely to start sending them out on the webinars. So one person on every webinar will be sent one of our branded CPD webinar. And of course, we want to see you on it. So there's your chance to show it off on social media. But I have just literally seen the order this week, genuinely, hands on heart, for CPD dressing gowns. So watch this space. You've got a Q&A box on your screen. So any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A box. And myself and Karen will try and get to as many of them as we can at the end of the webinar. And of course the chat option is there for you to chat, and I can already see you've got the emoji option because you're sending some fabulous little love arts for my dressing gown, and they come in two sizes, I think small and medium and large and extra large. So, and if you're anything in between, you'll have to put it on a boil wash. So yeah, it comes two sizes, that's it. If you are a member of CPD, of course, you will get a CPD certificate and the recording and everything that we hand out tonight that will automatically pop into your portfolio by magic tomorrow. Fabio and the team will be in the office from 9 o'clock. So once they've had their espressos and their latte macchiatos, they will get your certificates out. And of course, that will come by email and such. And there's lots of great reasons there to become a member of CPD. First of all, we will make recording your CPD super simple. So everything tonight, as I said, will automatically populate your portfolio. Then all you need to do is just reflect upon the learning experience. So it makes managing your shoebox of CPD super simple. And if you use our mobile app, which I know at least 100 people live here with us now have done, then recording and managing and capturing evidence and recording it is like literally 2 minutes. There you go, a little thumbs up there. It literally takes 2 minutes to capture your CPD. What have you done? Why have you done it? Scan some evidence, and then it's sat there. You don't need to worry about your shoebox theory, which I identified a long time ago. Great to get social with us, so please do follow us on social media. We are on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. So if you do send us a selfie tonight, obviously you're not going to have one of our dressing gowns just yet, but please do send us a selfie, tag us in with CPD Made Simple, and of course I've got some freebies to give away later. You'll get one of our free mugs or one of our USB dongles that we'll send to you in the post. So please do tag us in on social media. Always good as well if you tag us in, and if you pick up any golden learning nuggets tonight from Dr. Karen, then please do quote them on social media, because it's always good to see positive feedback. You know that we have we got any students online tonight? Give us a thumbs up, because I certainly know as a student, I did a module on head injuries and this would have been liquid gold for me, except I'm probably about 25 years too late now. Gosh, where was CPD when I was a student? But if you are a student, it means you get premium access to CPD completely free whilst you are at a college or a university. The only condition is you have to have a university registered email address. So please make sure that you use your email address. If you are in a WhatsApp group or you are in a student union, capture that, send it on your WhatsApp group so that your student colleagues and friends can benefit from this, because it will close for this year in around September and then reopen up again next year. So a great offer there for students. And you all know that we don't spend any money on advertising here. However, in saying that, we have just spent some money on dressing gowns, but I cannot wait to see you, ladies and gents out there, brandishing like a fashion catwalk our fabulous new attire. I mean, people buy hoodies, don't they, t-shirts? I think we're probably the only organisation that are actually going to issue dressing gowns. You'll probably see me in one at the emergency services show if you come. I'm going to wear one and just walk around in it all day. Marketing and promotion and all of that. But we don't spend any money on Facebook marketing or Twitter marketing. But what we do is bring amazing speakers and contents to you. But we do rely on your genuine feedback on Trustpilot, Google, App Stores. I always get told this, and I'm under the impression that Fabio wants you to. In fact, let's have an Android versus iPhone. So Android users, give us a thumbs up. Oh, there's not a lot of thumbs up coming there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 20, 26, 34. Okay, so please scan that QR code or go to the Android App Store and please leave us a review for our amazing app, because Fabio will be delighted tomorrow if you do that. But this might answer the question, because we've only got 6,500 people on the Android app and we've got 63,000 people on the iPhone app. So iPhone app users, give us a thumbs up. There's probably going to be more. Yeah, there we go. I suspected so. So please leave us some reviews on the iPhone App Store too, because that would be really useful. And Fabio loves it, so he'll be all over that tomorrow. And I'm sure he'll send you a personal thank you and reply to your message. That is all from me. I'm done. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and because we're almost there. So, Dr. Karen, smiling glamorously. Can you hear? Oh, I could be on mute possibly still.
Lovely. No, that's fine. I'm just share my screen and make sure that you can see what I think you can see.
Perfect.
Perfect. We're there. Okay. Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming along to the webinar tonight. I must admit, to see so many people here at 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening is very impressive. So I was asked to come and speak to you about the UK Concussion Guidelines for non-elite grassroots sport. And what I'm going to cover tonight is an overview of what the new UK Concussion Guidelines show, but probably just as importantly, my aim is to ensure that we as healthcare professionals are delivering a consistent message around the new guidelines. So the key message I want to get across tonight for you to share widely is that if in doubt, sit them out. And I'll come to that as we go through the webinar. So why me? Why am I speaking to you? So this is me back in my younger years. I played rugby for many, many years. You can see my father really liked to look after me. So this was one of the many occasions when I had a smack in the face or a smack on the head. I was never diagnosed with concussion. I'm sure I had concussion on several occasions, but there certainly wasn't the appreciation and the recognition of concussion back when I was playing. Since I finished playing, I've moved over into sports medicine, and I now work at Gloucester, but I spent about 10 years associated with Worcester Warriors before moving to Gloucester 4 years ago. So I've been in elite rugby for about 13 to 14 years, which has seen a really big change in the way that we manage concussion and our approach to concussion. I deal with a lot of concussion. About 20 to 25% of all of our match injuries are concussion. So this is my bread and butter and what I see every day. And whilst this is about grassroots sport, concussion is concussion. It doesn't matter if it's in the professional game or the amateur game. It's the same diagnosis. We just are fortunate in the professional game to have more resource to identify it. So these new guidelines were published in April 2023. And these came off the back of a lot of concern around concussion, which led to a DCMS, so a Department of Culture, Media and Sport for the government. They had a select committee inquiry into concussion in sport. And this basically found that there was a huge lack of care for athletes competing in grassroots sports with regards to concussion. There was a lack of awareness, a lack of education, and people were not being managed appropriately. there has been increasing concern around concussion in recent years, and I'll come to why a little bit later. But it certainly is a hot topic, and I suspect that's why there are so many of you who are interested in hearing about concussion tonight. So the important thing to note is that the target audience for these guidelines is not us as healthcare professionals, it is the general public. So it's anyone that's involved in sport at grassroots level, in any sport, where you don't have healthcare professionals in attendance. So this isn't where you have first aid, this isn't where you have physios and doctors who are there to look after people. This is the usual situation where you have some first aiders on the sidelines, parents, coaches, etc., etc. And importantly, the guidelines are for primary school age children and upwards. So all the way from your 4 and 5 year olds right the way through to your 80, 90-year-olds competing at the top end. So the guidelines aim is to educate. So it's educating people how to recognise a concussion and then how it should be managed. And we'll go through all of that this evening. So this is what we're talking about. It may not be football, may not be rugby, maybe cycling. Cycling has very significant numbers of crashes, for example. Horse racing has very high concussion rates. So all your pony club events at the weekend, the risk of concussion is really quite significant. So there are some key bits within the guidelines. And one of the key things that they talk about is that nobody should return to competition training or PE lessons within 24 hours of a suspected concussion. And this is really important. So this isn't you absolutely have concussion. This is anyone that gets removed because they might have concussion, unless they're cleared by a healthcare professional and they have passed their 24-hour mark, they shouldn't be going back onto the field. And that's crucial. And I'll talk later about a very tragic case that was part of what led to the DCMS inquiry. Importantly, though, because there's a lot of scaremongering and fear around concussion, most people who have a concussion fully recover, and they recover really quite quickly as long as they get the right care. So we as healthcare professionals can really help to look after people, but the education is key. We've got to make sure that it's suspected in the first case. All concussions are serious and shouldn't be underplayed. And certainly the days of in professional sport of people being proud to have been knocked out and get back up and play on, those days are gone. I'm not convinced they're gone in amateur sport yet. And certainly there's still a bit of bravado around concussion in certain sports. But it's important that everybody realises that we have to take this seriously. You only have one brain. It's got to last you your whole lifetime. So we need to look after people. And importantly, head injury can be fatal, okay? And that includes concussion. So there's a vast spectrum of head injury, and we need to be able to identify those that are more serious and then prevent concussions from turning into more serious issues and fatalities. So what I'm going to cover tonight is what concussion is, how common it is, what the risks are from concussion, what we know about the risks at the moment, and then talk a bit about how it's diagnosed and how we can identify it, both on the sidelines, because I suspect many of you are involved in amateur sport, and as health professionals when we're asked to do assessments on people. And then importantly, talk about how it should be managed and what we must be recommending for people going forwards. So what is concussion? So it is a traumatic brain injury. Okay, so a concussion can be caused by a direct blow to the head, so a direct force, or it can be caused by a blow elsewhere on the body, with the force being transmitted to the head, almost in like a whiplash type mechanism. So a sports-related concussion is obviously related to sport, but concussions can occur in all sorts of scenarios, and it's exactly the same pathophysiology. It just for sports-related concussion are related to sports, and non-sports are related not to sports, funnily enough. It is a form of minor traumatic brain injury, but concussion and minor traumatic brain injury shouldn't be used interchangeably. So you've got to think of concussion being a subset of minor traumatic brain injury. There are other types of minor traumatic brain injury. So this force that's transmitted through to the brain due to an impact on the head or onto the body initiates a neurotransmitter and a metabolic cascade, which potentially can cause axonal injury, but it produces massive blood flow change and inflammation that then affects the brain. And importantly, it causes an impairment of neurological function. So that's what a concussion is. If you were to do an MRI scan, a CT scan on someone with concussion, it will be normal. Okay, if it's not normal, it's not a concussion. So doing imaging on these patients generally isn't needed unless there are concerns that they may have a more significant traumatic brain injury. But it's a functional disturbance. And typically, it's very rapid in onset of symptoms. So you tend to get the symptoms coming on within minutes, if not hours. They can evolve, though, up to 48 hours post-injury. So it may be that you have very subtle symptoms initially, but then they evolve over the next 24 to 48 hours, which is why in professional rugby, we have time points that we recheck players at, and which is also why the guidance is that people should not return within 24 hours, because it may appear that they're okay initially, but they may worsen later on. Most concussions have a GCS of 15, so they don't have loss of consciousness. And this has been a complete misnomer for many, many years. People have thought, well, I wasn't knocked out, I wasn't concussed. And certainly this used to be what the players would say to me. And they would only want to come off the field if they'd been knocked out, and sometimes not even then. But less than 10% of concussions actually involve loss of consciousness. And if you do have a loss of consciousness with a concussion, then you should have a higher index of suspicion that they may have a more significant traumatic brain injury. That said, I have players knocked out every season, and they, touch wood, there are very few of them who end up having more significant injuries. So it should make you more concerned, but it shouldn't necessarily mean that they definitely have needing a CT head, for example. With concussion, about a third of people are completely symptom-free and back to normal within 1 to 2 days. And about 80 to 90% of them will recover within a week to 10 days. So people tend to get better really, really quickly. However, we do know that whilst the symptoms may have resolved, the brain takes a little bit longer to resolve, and which is why, as we come on to later, it's important there's a more gradual return to sporting activities, and we don't just chuck people back in at 2 days, because although they symptomatically may feel well, their brain is not yet fully recovered and resilient to further injury. So what are we talking about? Well, the guidelines, the UK guidelines talk about 4 domains of symptoms. So you have physical symptoms, which are things like headaches, dizziness, visual changes. I put loss of consciousness in italics because, as I say, it's not the most common symptom. Cognitive changes are very common. So not thinking clearly, feeling a bit slowed down, feeling a bit foggy, just not being as sharp as usual. Emotional symptoms are very commonly seen, and I've had players laughing hysterically at me on the sidelines, and it can swing either way. So it can make people very, very high to start with, and then people can become very low afterwards. And some of the long-term problematic effects of concussion can actually be emotionally related. So people suffering with anxiety or with low mood. The final domain is sleep, and this again can swing either way. So sometimes we'll have players saying they just cannot get to sleep, or they're waking up in the middle of the night and feeling fully awake. Equally, you can have players that have excessive fatigue and drowsiness, so it can be one way or the other. Essentially, the symptoms that you get depend on which part of your brain is being affected by the neurological dysfunction. So it can be anything, any kind of cognitive or emotional, physical function that your brain performs can be affected by the concussion. So what's the concern? Why has everyone got worried? Why has there been a DCMS inquiry into this? Why is everybody jumping up and down? Well, there are lots of lawsuits out there. So this probably all came to the fore because of the NFL. So in America, the American football, there was a big lawsuit by players against the NFL organization, and they won a multi-million dollar claim against the NFL for putting them at risk from poorly managed concussions. And there are lawsuits now going through against the Rugby Union, in the UK. Steve Thompson was very high profile recently, coming out and talking quite openly about his struggles with dementia. So there's a lot of interest in it at the moment. There are more and more cases of people having problems which may be related to concussion, and there's certainly a concern. So what's the incidence of concussion? So we don't really know is the answer. In the US every year, there's about 3 million attendances to hospitals with a sports-related concussion. We don't really know in the UK because there just isn't good data collected. And that's one of the things that came out of the inquiry. There's a great quote there. We really don't know about the exact level of incidence. And we think at least 50% of concussions go unreported and nobody ever says anything about them. And perhaps even people don't realise that they're concussed and don't recognise the symptoms for themselves. In the UK, we have 13.5 million football players turning out on a regular basis across the amateur league. So it's a huge number of people playing sport at the weekend. That's just football. So extrapolate that across all the other sports. There's a huge number of people and a huge number of head impacts happening every week. There have been some studies in the community game in rugby, and it looks from the evidence that they've got so far that there's probably around 4 to 4.5 concussions per 1,000 player hours within non-elite rugby. But again, whether we're really just touching the tip of the iceberg, I suspect we are. In professional sport, it's higher. So in elite rugby, you're probably talking about 18 concussions per 1,000 hours of match play. And as I said earlier, it's about 20 to 25% of injuries. But obviously the impacts are much bigger because of the physical conditioning that the players have. We know that more cases happen in children and adolescents. Their brains seem to be less resistant to concussion as they're still developing. And we think that it's more common in women compared to men. So as I said, there's no, if you do a scan of somebody's brain, you'll find a normal scan, so an MRI or a CT scan, you'll find it all looks completely normal. However, when they've used functional MRI scanning, they found that there's a lot of dysfunction of the brain on functional MRI. Looking at a cellular level, what we think is happening is that after a biomechanical injury to the brain, there's stretching of the cell membranes, which leads to a sudden release of neurotransmitters and ion flux across the cell membrane. And that, when you get all this release of neurotransmitters, they bind and they cause more and more activity of the brain. And at the same time, the ion fluxes activate the sodium potassium ATP channels, and so cause this sudden demand for glucose within the brain to function the channels. So you get this sudden spike in glucose demand, but at the same time you get a dip in cerebral blood flow related to the concussion. So you get this mismatch between energy demand and energy supply, and that seems to be what then causes some of the early dysfunction of the brain. As you can see, that starts to return to normal, but the cerebral blood flow remains depressed, and then the glucose use by the brain actually becomes depressed after a concussion, and that can last for, we think, around 7 to 10 days, something like that. And at this stage, the brain is more at risk of further injury. So if you were to have a further concussion at this stage, your brain is not as resistant and able to cope with it, which is why we think there is a problem with people returning in sport too early before they've fully recovered and their brain's a bit more susceptible to another injury. We also know that people having had a concussion are more at risk of having another injury of another sort. So it may not be another concussion, but lower limb injuries, ACL injuries, et cetera, are more common following injury. And we certainly see this. We are very cautious about trying to ensure that our players are activated well when they come back to play following a concussion. So there's certainly a risk if we're not looking after people in the early times. There's also another risk that we're concerned about is post-concussion syndrome. So as I said before, 90% of concussions resolve within 7 to 10 days. but 10% of people will have lingering symptoms that last longer than those 7 to 10 days. And a percentage of these people will have symptoms that go on for months and sometimes for years. So I think we had a player who I looked after previously that struggled with balance disturbance and dizziness for months and months. And he was out of play for about 6 to 9 months in the end. One of my ex-England teammates was forced to retire in her early to mid-20s because of repeat concussions. And she really suffered with a lot of headaches, inability to cope in busy environments, wanting to sit in a darkened room and just not have too many sensory stimuli. So it can be a really, really problematic situation. We think that if you remove a player when they're initially concussed, the risk of them getting a post-concussion syndrome goes down. So certainly the players I see, that those that tend to come off quickly tend to have less severe symptoms afterwards, and their symptoms seem to get better quicker. So it's really important that we're getting people off the field and they're not continuing to play. And as I said, you've got this mismatch of glucose supply and a demand in the brain. And that's going to cause problems if you're continuing to exercise whilst that's all going on. Post-concussion syndrome can be devastating for people and can have huge impacts on their career, on their schooling, particularly young children, and relationships and family life as well. So one of the really concerning, very rare but present complications of concussion is something called second impact syndrome. And this young man was a young man called Ben Robinson, who sadly died in 2011 when he was 14. So Ben was playing for his Rugby Union team at school in Northern Ireland in a school competition, and he suffered a series of head impacts over the course of the match. He was assessed 3 or 4 times during the game, and on every occasion was sent back to play, despite the concerns of his mother. He then collapsed on the pitch towards the later stages of the game and didn't wake up again, and sadly died in hospital a couple of days later. And what happened to Ben was he had this thing called second impact syndrome, where someone's had a concussion, then they get a further head knock shortly afterwards, and they get uncontrollable cerebral edema following the second impact. As I said, it's not common, but it's a very real and of course, extremely serious complication of concussion, which is why it's so important that we get people off the field when they sustain a concussion, or if there's any concern of a concussion. So the bit that's in the newspapers is around the long-term effects of concussion. And it's still a little bit unclear at the moment. There certainly are studies that show a link show that professional athletes have greater mortality from neurological diseases and dementia. So there's a study of professional Scottish footballers that showed about 11% had dementia as a cause of death on their death certificates, compared to the general population, which would be about 3%. It seems they live longer. However, the rates of dementia certainly seem to be higher in professionals. And this is seen in other sports as well, NFL being another example, Rugby Union. This seems to be true in professionals, but we don't yet know whether it's causal or not. So there's an association, but we don't yet have a proven causation. And it's very difficult because there are lots of other factors to take into account. Studies in amateur athletes haven't yet shown this association. So it's not clear whether it's the fact that the professional athletes are having such a greater burden of head impacts because they're doing much more training, they are much bigger, the impacts they're having are much more significant. We're not quite sure at the moment, but there's certainly increasing evidence, and this is an area that's going to be looked into very heavily over the next few years. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a brain at the bottom which has a CTE, so chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So this was the punch drunk syndrome that boxers were diagnosed with initially. It was picked up initially in boxers, and you get deposition of tau protein throughout the brain, which causes neurodegeneration and a progressive neurodegenerative condition, which can cause wide-ranging symptoms, from cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms. There's an awful lot of psychiatric type presentations with CTE. When you look at brain banks of professional athletes, so the biggest brain banks are in America, there is a much increased rate of CTE within the brain banks. It's not really seen very much in community brain banks, whereas it's certainly seen in professional athletes. So there is a clear association. The causation and what causes it is a bit unclear. So there's, is it the big concussions, or is it lots of small subconcussive events, which basically means lots of little knocks from repeated headers or from repeated tackles, where people don't get full-blown concussion, but their brain is taking repetitive impacts. So there's a lot of research going on into this to see whether people can work out what is there a threshold effect that you can't go over? What's the limit? What's the association? And I suspect we're going to learn a lot more about this over future years. But at the moment, what we do know is that we want to minimize concussion, and we want to pick up concussion when it happens and make sure it's looked after properly. And that's what the guidelines are very much focused on. So the new guidelines state that anyone with a suspected concussion should be immediately removed from the field of play. And there has been this problem because in professional sports, we started to bring in head injury assessments at the pitch side. And sadly, that's been misinterpreted, and head injury assessments have been starting to be done incorrectly by people in amateur sports. So to be absolutely clear, there are no head injury assessments in amateur sports other than somebody checking somebody for any sign of concussion. If there's any signs, they should come off. But if there's a concern, then they should be immediately removed from the field of play. You cannot do tests on somebody on the sidelines and then say that they're safe to go back on. So how do we recognise concussion? So these are the visible clues or signs, we would call them in the medical professional world. As I say, loss of consciousness is on there, but it's by no means needed. Any one of these, if you see them, should be enough to remove somebody on a precautionary note. You're not saying they definitely have concussion, but there's a suspicion they may. So there are lots on there. So lying motionless or slow to get up, any kind of balance disturbance or unsteadiness that's seen, people looking quite blank or taking a long time to respond to questions. The thing that we often see is their teammates get cross with them because they don't know what they're doing. They mess up the line out calls, or they don't know where they're in the wrong area of the park. And we had this recently. We had a player that we did not see any concerning event for, and it was only when the teammates were like, he has no idea what he's doing. He's messing everything up. Can you check them? So we took him off for a head injury assessment. It became very clear. And actually, when we looked back through the whole game, the only event we could find was where he took a big impact to the chest in a tackle, and there was perhaps a whiplash, but he stood up and carried on completely normally afterwards. So it can be very difficult to pick up. So you have to keep an eye on people, not just in the impact, but subsequent to the impact, and take what their teammates say very, very seriously. Anyone who's grabbing or clutching at their head, an impact seizure, and I'll show you an example of this in a moment. Tonic posturing, again, I'll show you what this looks like if you've not seen this before. And the emotional lability. So this can go either way. So I think I said earlier, you get people who are hysterical at the sides of the pitch, giggling and laughing, or you get people that suddenly become very, very emotional and can't stop crying. And sometimes it's just somebody being very irritable, out of character. I was covering a game when I was about 7 months pregnant out in Ireland, and one of our very lovely props took a head impact, and I went across and said, no, you need to come off. I'm sorry, I'm not happy. And I thought he was going to deck me. And he was a lovely guy. And afterwards he was mortified. But you just don't know how people are going to react. So you have to know the people you're looking after, and also if you don't know them, ask people that do know them what they're like normally. The other thing we look out for is vomiting or nausea, and that could be a sign of concussion as well. So I've had a few issues with my video playing, so I may need to I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just change over to sharing my other. Okay. So I'm hoping that people can see now. So this is an example of loss of consciousness. Just make it larger. So what we're looking at here is this, the Australian number 13 coming across. So it's pretty obvious, this one. Hopefully people will pick this up, but you can see he comes across,
head on the wrong side,
gets his head on the wrong side, takes an impact to his temporal region, and he's making no attempt to protect himself as he falls and face flat into the turf. So what we look for is if we floppy around the neck, so hypotonia of the neck, or somebody that just doesn't protect themselves when they go to ground or when they're on the ground. I'll just show that one more time. As I say, it can be much more subtle than that, and may not be as obvious.
See, head on the wrong side. The flag belongs to Kirshner.
So I'm going to show you. Oops,
That's out.
We'll keep having that playing in the background. So this is an example of ataxia or balance disturbance. So what I want you to look for here, if you look in the yellow circle, you'll see the man in the black and red with the red on his shoulder. He's got a 9 on his back. If you follow him, he comes through here, makes a tackle. We can't really see a great deal in that. But watch what he does now, the way he walks as he goes back. It's just past the ref. And he looks like he's, yeah, he looks like he's dancing, doesn't he? So this is quite a good example of ataxia. So ataxia is balance disturbance. So it can be somebody who's struggling to get off the ground, or it can be like this gentleman where they're not able to support themselves in the normal way. Okay.
This game
and got a couple more to show you.
Oh, sorry, Karen. When you click on full screen, it doesn't look like it's broadcasting. So if you keep it on the small screen like that,
oh, okay.
Play.
Okay, I'll go back to the previous one then. So if I show the loss of consciousness again, let me just go back to the beginning. Sorry that it's technically not working well. Is that working for you now?
Perfect.
Perfect. So as I said before, so this is 13 in the gold. You'll see it again in a second. So he gets his head on the wrong side, low on the temple, and just loses tone in his neck and makes no attempt to protect himself. He lands face down on the turf. That's a very classic example of what a loss of consciousness looks like. It can be, as I say, much more subtle than that. Let's pause that. And I'll show you the ataxia again. Let me come back. Sorry. Here we are. So yellow circle there. So this player in black and red, he's got 9 on his back now, just behind the referee, and he's going to walk back very unsteadily back onto his side. Play that for you again. It's a little bit hard to see the first time. And you see, so he just looks like he's dancing a little bit. Very abnormal gait. As I say, sometimes it can be that people are just taking time to stand up and what we call tripoding, which is where they get onto both hands and their knees and they just take their time before they get back up. I'm going to show you tonic posturing now. So look at the number 14 here. He's got the yellow circle around him. He comes and makes head-on-head collision with his teammate. the other all black. And if this arm goes up in the air, and this is a very good example of tonic posturing. I'll just play that again for you. So you'll see head-on-head impact there, nasty impact, and he goes stiff and rigid. And we classically see these arms going up in the air. There's often, it's often a very abnormal movement that we see with that. And again, it can be difficult if you've not got a great view to be sure. So, but if you think you've seen it, you probably have. So if in doubt, sit them out. You've got to take people off. So this is a Serbian schoolboys football match, and what you're going to look for now is the goalie. This is an example of a post-traumatic seizure. So he takes an elbow to the head and goes to the ground, and then watch, he becomes very, very stiff, and almost you think, oh, he's going to get up, and then he starts seizing. So that's very typical. It's not the moment of impact they have a seizure. It tends to be 10, 20, 30 seconds afterwards that the post-traumatic seizure happens. And it's sometimes not always a tonic-clonic seizure. So it can just be rigidity, eyes rolling back. But if anyone has a post-traumatic seizure, we'll go through this, they need to be taken to hospital for an assessment. So I've just stopped my screen sharing. I'm going to try and get back to my slideshow. Andrew, can you see that now?
Perfect.
Perfect. Right. Great. We're back on track. So apologies for the lack of technological aptitude by myself. So we've looked at the ataxia. We've looked at the impact seizure. We looked at tonic posturing. Perfect. So you've looked for your signs. The other things you need to think about are symptoms. The problems with symptoms is that you rely on players, and sometimes they're very honest, but they're often not honest in the heat of battle, as they call it. So you have to kind of keep an eye on people as well, and but you need to specifically ask people about symptoms, and giving somebody a bit of time to chill out, come away from the game or the event that they're competing in, and then asking them is important. And as I say, some of these are subtle to start with, and then will get worse over a period of time. So that serial review of people is important. These range, as I said before, across all the areas. So it may be disorientation, headache, dizziness, mental clouding. And these are the symptoms that we're asking the teammates, coaches, parents, etc., to look out for. If there's any concern expressed by a parent, an official, or a spectator, then that is should be taken very seriously, and people should be removed. So any one of these symptoms or signs should lead to the athlete being removed. And as I say, it doesn't mean they necessarily have a concussion, but there should be a suspicion that they do have a concussion. It sounds very complicated when you have all these lists of different things. And there was a recent concussion consensus statement that was published, which updated something called the concussion recognition tool. And this is like a pocket tool that can be used by non-healthcare professionals to help them recognise concussion. So it's encouraged. They don't specifically mention it in the UK guidelines, but this is something that can be used and can be quite helpful for people who aren't used to dealing with concussion, to try and remember it. So the key message that the guidelines get across is, if in doubt, sit them out. If there is any concern about a concussion, that player should not be returning to the field that day. They should not be going to their next PE lesson, their other sporting events. They need to have at least 24 hours without any activity, without sport, and then they need to have further assessment. Importantly, there are some red flags that we need to, people are being asked to look out for in the grassroots sport arena. And these are those that require urgent medical assessment. So that can be on site if there is the facility on site. So certainly at some tournaments, there might be some healthcare professionals there. Or if not, then they need to be going to A&E. And these are, as listed here, so someone who's lost consciousness definitely needs to get assessed. If there's a deterioration in their level of consciousness, I'm sure we'd all agree we want them to go. Amnesia, confusion, irritability, neurological change or behavioural change, seizures, as we talked about earlier, And somebody who has increasing headache or vomiting, neck pain, again, and suspicion of skull fracture, if they've got a previous brain surgery or bleeding disorder, if they're on blood thinners, or if they're intoxicated. So relatively sensible things, and these should all be going to have a further assessment. So the advice that athletes and carers are given by the new guidelines is that anyone who has a suspected concussion should be assessed by a healthcare professional, either by a healthcare professional face-to-face at the time, or they should access the NHS by calling 111 within 24 hours of the injury. So everybody is advised to have an assessment either via 111 or by accessing a healthcare professional themselves. It's yet to, I'm not yet clear what 111 do with all these cases, and certainly having worked in A&E, I suspect they will get directed up to A&E more often than not, but that may be me being a little bit cynical. But it's not yet clear, and I don't think we've yet seen the impact of that on 111. And certainly if all the concussions that I suspect are happening start getting reported and 111 starts getting called about them, it's going to be quite a sizable workload for them. So the advice that's given is the do's are they should be removed from play immediately, as we've said before. They should rest and sleep as needed for the first 24 to 48 hours. And there's always been this thing that people wake people up to check that they're still rousable. People should be allowed to sleep, okay? And we need to stop being concerned that people are tired and sleeping, and let people rest. And the key thing is rest and sleep is good for your brain, good for your recovery. There is advice to minimize smartphone and screen and computer use for at least for the first 48 hours. It's a little bit of debate about how important this is, but certainly in the first 24 to 48 hours, people should be minimizing the amount that they're on their devices for, which can be pretty challenging if you've got a teenager. The do nots, so they should not be left alone for the first 24 hours. So it's important that they go with a carer or a friend or a parent to take them home. And they shouldn't consume alcohol either during the first 24 hours and if they've got persistent symptoms following that. They shouldn't drive a motor vehicle for the first 24 hours, and commercial drivers with a suspected concussion need to have a review by a healthcare professional to say that they're fit to return to commercial driving before they're allowed to go back. So what about us? So as healthcare professionals, if we have people that come in or are presenting to us in whatever environment with a suspected concussion, what do we need to think about? Well, I think the key considerations for us are, firstly, do they have any associated injury? And the one I'm thinking of mainly is a neck injury. So it's important not to overlook it, do a good assessment of the neck, look at them generally and make sure that they've got no associated injuries. And then we need to think about, do they need a CT head? Is this just a concussion, or is this a more significant brain injury that we need to be doing further imaging for? And we can use the NICE guidelines for that. And then the next is there evidence for concussion? And we'll talk about how we look at that. And then finally, what discharge advice do they need? And we'll come on to what the guidelines recommend for people following a concussion. So the NICE head injury guidelines have recently been updated back in May. There hasn't been a huge amount of difference, to be honest, to the indications for a CT head. There's a little bit of more nuance around anticoagulations, saying that they should consider having a CT when somebody is on anticoagulations, anticoagulants. But there's quite clear things that we need to be looking out for in adults. If they have more than one episode of vomiting, then you're going to be CTing them. And if they have that post-traumatic seizure that we saw in that video clip, then they should have a CT. And anyone that has reductions in their GCS at specific time points as up on the screen. The under 16s guidance is slightly different. It's a little bit more conservative. So there are certain things that we will definitely do CT heads for straight away. And then there are another group of symptoms on the right-hand side that actually, if they have more than one of them, then you would CT them. But if they only have one, then you may just observe them and keep an eye on them. for a minimum of 4 hours within a hospital setting. So how can we diagnose concussion? So there are some tools out there. So there's something called the SCAT-6. So it was the SCAT-5. It's been updated back earlier this year to this, or back in June, only last month, to the SCAT-6 tool, which is almost identical, to be honest, to the SCAT-5. There are some minor changes. And this is a multimodal assessment. So it looks at symptom scores, it looks at balance testing, it looks at cognitive testing, concentration, etc., etc. In an emergency department setting, it was studied out in Australia by Silk et al. back last year. They looked at the SCAT-5 to see how useful it was. And they found that it's actually very time consuming. And it really didn't add an awful lot having all of the other multimodal assessments in there compared to just having the post-concussion symptom score. So their recommendation was that really, actually, we just need to make sure that we're asking really good questions around symptoms. And if people have symptoms following a head impact, then they're concussed until proven otherwise. So they should be managed as a concussion. There is something called the ED concussion assessment tool, the ED-CAT, which was studied by Mystery and Rayner back in 2018. They did a pilot study. It's basically a mini version of the SCAT. And they showed that it's had some promise, but there's not been, to my knowledge, another study published as yet to show that whether it's helpful or not. So really what you need to do if you're a healthcare professional assessing somebody with concussion is do a really good symptom assessment, do a full neurological examination, looking for focal neurological signs. And then if they have symptoms, but no red flags for a CT and no neurological deficit, then you can diagnose them with a concussion. So this is the post-concussion symptom severity tool, and it basically is all the symptoms that we ask about earlier, and scoring them from 0, which is none, to severe, which is 6. So it's slightly unusual because we're used to a 0 to 10. But again, the absolute number doesn't matter. It's just a way of picking up the symptoms. And if they're symptomatic and they've had a head injury, then they're concussed. So on to recovery. So the recommendation in the guidelines from April is that everyone who is diagnosed with a concussion or has a suspicion of a concussion that is not ruled out by a healthcare professional should go through a graduated return to activity, which is educational work and sport. Okay, so and I think it's really important that we may get people coming in with concussion from other means. So people who have had road traffic accidents, if they are a sporty person and they are going to go back to contact or sports where there's a potential for collisions, they need to also go through this same process. So we should be giving advice to people if they have concussion, regardless of the etiology of the concussion, and make sure that they aren't going to put themselves at risk by returning with a concussion, regardless of where they got the concussion. So the general principles of the graduated return are that there's a short period of relative rest, 24 to 48 hours, as I said earlier. And we say relative rest. So we used to be very strict that you couldn't do anything. You had to sit in a dark room and do nothing and get very, very miserable and depressed about the fact you were concussed. Whereas actually now we're a bit more pragmatic. So, you know, you tell a teenager they cannot touch their phone for 48 hours, or they're going to go crazy. So it's about relative rest, not making themselves feel worse. They can potter around the house. They can go outside, potter around. It's not about being completely still and full enforced rest. But then after that, actually, there is now good evidence that we need to get people going again in a graduated stepwise approach. So the approach is that they should be getting back to normal life first and then subsequently to sport. And the important part is it's not a jump. You don't go from resting for 24 hours to suddenly returning back into sport. This can usually be self-managed unless there are complications or unusual symptoms that mean they need a review. And its aim is to limit symptoms. So ideally, people are symptom-free within 24, 48 hours. But sometimes people do have residual symptoms. That doesn't mean that they can't then progress through the graduated return, as long as their symptoms are not exacerbated or only very mildly exacerbated by any activity they do. So if they feel ever so slightly worse when they're doing something, but as soon as they stop they feel okay, then that's okay. But if they can feel much worse and feel worse afterwards, that shows they've done too much and they need to take a step back. And importantly, they shouldn't have new symptoms when they're doing something. It's important it's individualized. So there isn't a day 1 you do this, day 2 you do this, day 3. It's very much move through at your own pace. But the one thing that's very key is that they should have no return to sports competition before 21 days. And if they get to the point at 28 days where they have prolonged symptoms, so more than 28 days, or their symptoms are very severe, then they need to go and see their GP or another healthcare professional. So this is what it looks like. It's, as I say, a stepwise approach from stage 1, which is their relative rest period, through gradually introduction of daily activities, so going for short walks, for example, starting to do some non-work or school related activities, so a bit more board games, watching a bit more TV, etc. Then they go on to stage 3, which is where you increase their tolerance for mental and exercise activities. So you would increase their study or work related. So this could be that you start doing a bit of homework at home for school-aged children, where they do some activities, then have a good rest afterwards in a home setting. Again, work, you might do a little bit of work and then have a rest. And you can increase the activity of the exercise. You can bring in some light exercise at this stage, do some body weight resistance training. So literally body weight, no added weight on the top of it. And then at stage 4, you start returning to non-contact sport training. Okay, so this is where you can get back to the gym, start lifting some weights. You can do some skills training. You can get back into non-contact practice, and at the same time as potentially returning part-time to school or work. Okay, and then stage 5 is when you return to full training or full work. And importantly, if you're going to go into full training, you have to have been symptom-free at rest for 14 days prior to that. So it may not be, you don't know when that's going to be, but they have to have 2 full weeks of feeling well at rest before they get back into full training. And that can include contact. And then, as I say, the final stage has to be at least 21 days after injury. These don't necessarily have to go hand in hand. So it doesn't have to be that you get back to sport at the same pace as you get back to school activity. But you should consider working through in a stepwise fashion for both. And it may be that people can get back to work and school quite well and relatively quickly, but their return to sport takes longer. But it's important they shouldn't be returning to sport before they're returning to school. You can return to school and work, but you should first, but you shouldn't do it the other way around. So this is the more complex advice. It sets it out in a little bit more detail, and this is all in the UK sport guidance. And it would be a really good idea to be able to have this to give to people, or at least know how to signpost them to get the advice and self-guidance that they need. So this stage 1, stage 3, stage 4, 5, and 6. And as I said, it's very much about working through, thinking about your mental activities and your physical activities and separating them off as to what you're doing. So that's been a whistle-stop tour through concussion. I think the things I really want to take home is that concussion is common and has significant risks associated with it. We need to take it seriously. Concussion recognition is everyone's responsibility, and certainly we as healthcare professionals have been guilty about not thinking about it. I don't know how many times I've said to my junior docs, do you think they're concussed? Oh, I hadn't thought about concussion. So we need to think anyone with a head injury, if we don't think they've got a serious brain injury in terms of needing a CT scan, that doesn't mean they don't have a serious brain injury in terms of having a concussion. If in doubt, sit them out. And anyone who has a concussion should undergo this graduated return to activity in sport. So if in doubt, sit them out. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Karen, thank you so much indeed. I have made about 25 notes, but I'm intrigued in the audience because we've still got over 250 people on here, and I think we've got 105 on YouTube. So please pop your golden learning nuggets for us in the chat, because I'm intrigued what key message you're going to take away from tonight, because that'll be really useful. Dr. Karen, if you have a quick look at the questions and answers and click which ones you want to answer live, and if anybody wants to squeeze a question in quick, please do put it into the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. And I have just put the link to the feedback. In fact, I'll do it again now because the chat's moving that quick in there. So please do leave some feedback, and then we can send that to Karen tomorrow, who can use that for her own CPD. And then it creates a little CPD bubble for me, for Karen, and for everybody in the audience tonight. So fabulous. So if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A box. I'm just going to quickly whiz through what's going down here, and then hopefully we'll get to the Q&A box. So if I just share my screen. And I will pop the links to the YouTube videos on social media tomorrow. So if anyone wants to watch them back or to share them, then you're more than welcome to. I'll make sure that we get them onto to Twitter and such. We have got a few events coming up. Saturday the 5th of August. It's on the website, Major Incidents and Disasters International Masterclass. It truly is an international masterclass. We've got speakers from all over the world, including the Lebanese Red Cross. We've got responders who attended 9/11. We've got the head of NHS England's EPRR. It really is a true masterclass there. So please do scan that QR code. And if you are a member, it's £4.99. It literally is like almost a cup of coffee. We're also supporting an event in Cardiff Stadium next year, 27th of March. So please do scan that QR code or go to EMS UK Learning, because we will be there as a sponsor of that event. So, and again, it's about £25 for a ticket. So please grab that. And again, I'll share all these on social media tomorrow for you. And we are also sponsoring the Faculty of Pre-Hospital Care Conference on Monday the 6th till Tuesday the 7th. So myself and the fabulous CPDME team will be up there in Edinburgh, doing all things Scottish. I won't be wearing a kilt. If anybody quickly thinks about that in the chat, might have one of my dressing gowns on, but it won't be a kilt. And we've got a few more webinars coming there. So you've got the app, have a look at up and coming webinars. There's some amazing learning and development opportunities for you coming very, very soon. So, and you've got me talking about building a portfolio on the 19th of July, but you can see me anytime you want. And before we do the Q&A, we are still looking for some CPD webinar facilitators, because I think that I'm about to get fired. So we're looking for my replacement ultimately. I think they're retiring me off the shelf. But if you are interested, drop us an email to the team. We had 27 applications this week, but we are looking for 6 people. So get your applications in and come and join the team. It's amazing. Right, let's have a look at the Q&A. Let me stop sharing my screen and we'll see what questions we've got. It's jumped up, so we've got 10 now. So Gavin has asked, but first aiders do not recognise concussion, and SCAT5 is an HCP document only. So until HCPs are compulsory attendance at all levels, it will not improve. What's your thoughts, Karen?
So I can see what you're saying, Gavin, and that's definitely a concern. I think that's where sports need to get this right, because realistically, we're not going to have healthcare professionals present at all levels of sport. There are just too many events happening around the country. But we do have coaches, we do have first aiders who all have to have a certain level of training. And it's about upskilling those groups so that they can recognise a concussion. And I think educating mainly around the risks of concussion, so that we can people really understand the seriousness, and there is less willingness to ignore it. Interestingly, the group I have had the most problems with are parents. So often it's the parents who don't want to don't want to accept that their child might have had a concussion. And sometimes you can have to, as a healthcare professional, it can be really challenging to pull a child off. I can imagine as a coach it would be really difficult. So, but actually with a bit of education, I don't think anyone wants to put their child at risk. But it's about education and teaching people what they're dealing with and what they're looking for. So yes, I agree with you. SCAT6 is not for the bystanders. The concussion recognition tool has a place, but this is about upskilling people. And there are, in rugby, for example, there's the Head Case project where they're putting a lot of work into trying to get coaches, parents athletes to understand what concussion is and how to recognise it, and that's being replicated. I think rugby league is Don't Be a Head case. There's similar in football and other sports. So there's not been enough done. I think we're rapidly trying to catch up, but education is key. I think healthcare professionals have not been well educated on concussion over the years, and hopefully that's going to change and starting to change with things like this. But yeah, we're not going to have healthcare professionals at every sporting event around the country.
Yeah, I was thinking actually, as you're going through the presentation, when I did my paramedic degree, what did I cover on concussion? And I think it was probably about 3 slides. Nowhere in as depth as what you've covered tonight. Nowhere near. In fact, it was almost like a whistle-stop tour. And so, you talked about some safety netting earlier, and I am Mr. Safety Netting. That's ultimately my full-time real role. But Gavin's also asked, how do you stop people driving when they travel alone with heavy horse boxes to equestrian events?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's thinking ahead and having a plan. But that's not easy if you're, as you say, if you're competing as individuals and driving your own horse box. It's about education and people around them saying you should not drive. So there is certainly, from a team sport perspective, it's easier to do. So we would never let anybody drive home, get their teammates to drive them home in the car. When you've got somebody who's got a horse box somewhere, gosh, that's a really difficult scenario. I don't know what they do, whether there's anything in place. I don't know if anybody is a horse involved in horse riding and knows if there is anything out there. But I think that's a big problem, because you don't want people with concussion to be driving if they've got depressed reaction times and they're cognitively not functioning normally. They shouldn't be driving big, heavy horse boxes anywhere. Yeah,
I'm lucky and unlucky to live near a horse arena, and often during my day job would get called out to horse-related incidents, concussions, collapses, neck injuries and such. Most professional horse arenas are kitted up for this, and they are very much aware that people will come on their own sometimes. And I can distinctly remember 2 cases where they would not let that person take their horse and horse box home, and actually waited there until after closing time till a relative was able to come with somebody else and take the horse, and then the individual was taken home, escorted, not driving their own vehicle. So common sense often is prevailing at these events, and often they've got qualified first aiders who give that very similar advice. I remember that they were extending that advice when I went to the last incident there. So usually that does happen. There's always provision, and I think on one occasion they looked after the horse overnight because the person wasn't able to drive the horse box, so they took the car with the injured, and then somebody came back the following day to look after the horse. So
brilliant.
There's always a fix. Always a fix. Another anonymous question: how are the saliva tests progressing?
Great question. So we have been, for people that don't know about the saliva tests, this is a mRNA study where we've been collecting saliva from players within rugby and other sports over the last, goodness knows, 4 or 5 seasons. It seems to have been going on forever, where when somebody has a head injury assessment, they get the saliva swabbed at the time they come off for their 12-minute assessment. They then get their saliva swabbed when they come in post-game for another assessment, and they get the saliva swabbed 36 to 48 hours afterwards. And what they've been looking for is changes in the mRNA that they think may be related to the concussion. So far, they have had reasonably good results from a panel of, I think it's 13 mRNAs. If you use them together, you get quite good sensitivity and specificity for concussion. The problem is the cost of that. So if you're running multiple studies, that's not going to be you can't roll that out into the non-professional game. And what they really want is a test so that actually we don't need everybody on the sidelines making decisions. We have a test where they can then just spit on do a bit like a pregnancy test, spit on a saliva swab and then get a yes or no. So what they've been trying to do is narrow it down to three tests. I don't know the results of that. That was ongoing in the Premiership last year, and at the moment it's being analysed. But the hope is that they may be able to develop a a test that has sufficient sensitivity and specificity to be able to be used, certainly in amateur sport, for concussion. And it'd be wonderful. I would love to have a test that told me if somebody was concussed or not. So it's the data collection is almost done. I know they're continuing in the women's premiership, women's rugby premiership this coming season, because they haven't got enough data yet in women. But they've closed collection in male rugby players for us. So watch this space.
Fab. Last couple of questions. We've got one from Thomas. Do you think it's been ignored largely because there are no explicit medical markers for concussion? It seems to have been taken up by neuropsychology, which has made some striving progress in the area, but this doesn't seem to translate to pre-hospital care.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's partly that, so it's incredibly subjective, and often the only thing that will tell me that a player is concussed is if they tell me that they're concussed because they don't feel very well. So we do something called the head injury assessment in rugby, which basically we go in and take somebody inside and do some cognitive tests on them, do some memory tests, do some balance tests, etc., etc. It's helpful because it allows people to calm down. It is not foolproof by any means. So I've had players who I've definitely known are concussed who've flown through the test. And the only reason that they failed is either because I've known them and have thought you're not right, or because they've admitted that they don't feel right. So often the only thing we have that tells us that someone's concussed is their symptoms. And so I think it's partly it's been ignored because people can't diagnose it, and partly it's been ignored because people just haven't reported. And as I said at the beginning, I was a player. I certainly had some evenings where I didn't feel great after a rugby match, and I didn't report it, and I was a doctor. So I just don't think we understood at the time, and people still probably don't understand sufficiently how important it is that we look after concussion properly. So I think it's partly a lack of a test and partly a lack of education and a lack of understanding of how significant and serious the condition is.
Fab. And last question from Alex is, do you have any thoughts on the new RFU tackle height changes and their impact on head injury incidents in grassroots rugby?
Yeah, so I think they could have got the messaging better, which I think the RFU accept. The consultation process was insufficient, to be polite. I think it's important. And I do think there is good evidence to suggest that it will reduce the risk of head injury. There was a lot of debate around whether it should be going down to below sternum height, so below shoulder height, below sternum, or going below waist, because there's this, actually you want people to be in the soft bit in the middle. You don't want them to hit head on head. You don't want them to hit hip on head. You want them in the nice soft bit. But the concern at the beginning of the process was that if you say to go for this bit here, actually the margin of error is not very big. So it's quite easy to go for a midway tackle and end up clashing heads still. And that seems to be the bit that's the biggest risk for both the ball carrier and the tackler, is the head-on-head collisions. We've in the professional game and the amateur game, there have been increasing rule changes to try and change people's behaviour by, red cards for head-on-head collisions in tackles for the tackler. It hasn't worked, and people are still getting red cards regularly, and it hasn't really changed the way that the game is being coached. I'm sure there will be change in the professional game very soon. I don't think it's going to be this season, but I can't see it being very far away, because they need to find a way to get rid of these head-on-head collisions. Interestingly, though, it's been done in France, and they have so far had very good results from it. It has really reduced their concussion rates. So in France, they put in quite a lot of extra bits to it. So they changed the laws for the ball carrier as well. They haven't, to my understanding, yet done that in the RFU. So I think this is a work in progress. I think it needed to happen, and I think it should improve concussion incidents. what remains to be seen is what effect it has on other injuries. But I think the concept is right. We just need to watch it very carefully to see what happens.
Dr. Karen, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. And you are literally have got so much into an hour and 10 minutes. That is like fabulous. Thank you so much. So I have just popped the links in there for people to give us some feedback. I've also put the links in the chat for people to give Dr. Karen some feedback for her own CPD. Members, you will get your certificates tomorrow. They will come at 10 o'clock in the morning once Fabio's had his coffee. And it has been great to have you all on board tonight. Dr. Karen, there is lots of fabulously nice comments going up there in the chat. And lots of claps and lots of people sending confetti cannons and hearts, which tells us that people have had an amazing learning and development experience, which is ultimately what this is all about. So I'm sure these people, empowered with your new knowledge, will take that away and do us a good cause. But Karen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we most definitely will have you back at some point in the future, no doubt.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen. Ladies and gents, that's all we've got for this evening. So if you are at work, please stay safe. You are doing an amazing job. Whatever you're doing tonight, you are doing an amazing job. Be kind to yourself. If you are at home in your dressing gowns, kick off your slippers. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining us and supporting me and my amazing team here at CPDME. And we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody, and good night. Thank you. Bye.